In today's video, this will be the final installment of the International Farmall Cub tractors, and I'm going to include the Cub Lowboys, the 154, 184, and 185 Lowboys as well. I've got a lot of period advertising to share with you. In 1964, IH introduced their 04 series tractors, the 504, 404, etc. And they had a different grill on them and some different styling, so they wanted to update their smaller tractors. So IH did that with the Cubs and the 140s. So you'll see a lot of similarities between the Cub and the 140. Up close, they are obviously very different, but from afar they kind of look similar, and primarily with their offset Cultivision. And IH did keep that design with their Cub tractors, the Farmall, the Farmall version. They were still branded International, but people call the Farmall ones the High Boys and the International ones the Low Boys, because that's the way they used to be. Regardless, in 1964 they redesigned them. They were 12 volt, and there was a few tractors. I think there was about 700 of them that were special ordered, and they were supposed to go to Canada, but for whatever reason the deal fell through. And they were painted this color here, this white and red. I think it's a sharp color. I think it's a color that they should have offered all along. This is not one of those tractors. It's a certain serial number range, and they were all basically distributed here along the East Coast. But I like the look of it, so I painted this tractor to look like those 700 or so tractors. Until 1969 or 68, I think it was 68, the Lowboy looked just like this one. It just was shorter, as was before. But in late 68 they came out with the 154 Lowboy, which had the same motor, same transmission, but the motor and transmission were centralized. They had a better seat, a lot of updated safety features. They also had an independent PTO, meaning that you could push the clutch in and the power takeoff would still continue going. The power takeoff was still not 540 as you would notice on larger equipment, because it would not run it. But a 3-point hitch was optional, and there was a line of 3-point hitch attachments. Mott made a nice flail mower that could have gone on the back of there. There was a high-low that was eventually introduced, so you could get a total of 6 forward and 2 reverse gears on the Cub, and I think that's a pretty ideal way to have the Cub. Now I am told by someone who worked at IH that the 154, they had a problem right with the transmission bolted on to the frame, so they would tend to have a weak point there and break. So his job was to fix those. The Cub Lowboy and the Cub of 1964 were still around 10 horsepower, and they were upped a little bit in the mid 60s, and the final version of those came out in 1975 with this long stripe version. Now the model that I was telling you about, the Canadian model, didn't have the long stripe on it, just had it said International Cub. It was kind of like a little black decal with silver letters. This long stripe version came out in 75, and this was a 15 horsepower tractor. And if you take this tractor compared to the original 47 Cub, this thing will run circles around it. It runs everything that I want to run, and it runs it beautifully, whereas the earlier Cub will struggle sometimes. Now, for whatever reason, the motor was only 15 horse here in the High Boy, but the 185, the final version of the Cub, was red, and it had 18 horsepower. So I don't know why they didn't carry over the horsepower on that. But I also know that International had in the works a hydrostatic transmission to go in the Cub, and for whatever reason it never was introduced. I think that would have been a great feature, but by the end of the 70s, diesel tractors were kind of coming into fashion, in compact tractors, I should say. Kubota had already entered the market in the early 70s. In the late 70s, John Deere had their 850, 950, which were Yanmar tractors. And about the time that the Cub and the 140 were being discontinued, International had gone into a joint venture with Mitsubishi Japan, so Mitsubishi was making a nice compact tractor for International. They had the 274 offset, and they also just had the 284. There was a whole series of tractors, 2-wheel drive and 4-wheel drive, that came out. Later on, Case IH kind of carried over that 274 design, so they had an offset tractor for a little while, and that was made by Mitsubishi as well. Mazda was in there too with some of those 200 series tractors, so you could buy that late 70s, early 80s tractor with either a Mazda gas engine or a Mitsubishi diesel engine. In the late 50s, all through the 50s, actually, a lot of Americans were moving to the suburbs, and they were getting a little square piece of land. Jonestowns were coming into play in the 40s and in the 50s, so whole towns were being established, and people had their little plot in the suburbs, and they wanted something to mow their lawns, clear their snow, and sometimes they had a little garden. So International Harvester came out in 1960 with the Cub Cadet, and in 64 they came out with a hydrostatic. It was a Sunstrand hydrostatic, but they also still had a manual drive or a manual shift Cub Cadet, and that transmission and rear end were the same as in the Cub, the Farmall Cub. They were just a little bit modified to obviously fit in a smaller tractor. These first Cub Cadets were a narrow frame tractor, and they were one of the first lawn and garden tractors out there on the market. Very robustly made. They were made in Kentucky. And in 1971, they came out with their wide frame tractors, and then they had their Quiet Line. I think came out in '74. The Quiet Line had the side shields on it, and I've had some of the Quiet Lines. Very nice tractor, but the problem that you get is the sides kind of hold the front, so sometimes you'll see people don't have the sides on, and then the whole thing's wobbly, but it's got a spring on it, so it's a little bit of a thing to get it all put back together correctly, but still a very nice tractor. Those had Kohler motors in them. About 1975 or 76, International came out with a lawn tractor version, which was basically a downscaled version of the garden tractor, so they didn't have the heavy-duty status of the garden tractor, but they could still plow snow or snow blow, but they couldn't run tillage equipment. So, a lot of folks didn't have garden, they didn't need the real heavy garden tractor, so they were happy with a lawn tractor or a yard tractor. And those were around until 1981. In the late 70s, early 80s, the agricultural market took a huge downturn, and International Harvester was not spared. So in an effort to save the company, they sold off their Cub Cadet brand of tractors to MTD, Modern Tool and Die Company. And they ran that as a subsidiary of MTD for a while, and called it Cub Cadet Corporation. And from 1981 until the end of International Harvester in 1985, they were still building Cub Cadet tractors for International. They stuck the IH emblems on them. They were painted red. Those went to the agricultural dealerships. The lawn and garden dealerships, you got to remember, until maybe 15 years ago, John Deere and Cub Cadet, they were subsidiaries of their parent companies, but you could go to there was a Ford dealership up here, sold Ford cars and trucks, and they had a little John Deere sign out, and they sold John Deere lawn and garden equipment. So similarly with Cub Cadet, they had red tractors that went to the farm equipment dealers, yellow that went to the hardware stores, and just the family-run lawn and garden equipment sales. So just an interesting tidbit there. One of the greatest things that International Harvester and then Cub Cadet by MTD had going for them was that they were a shaft-driven tractor, meaning there was no belts. It was just a direct connection from the motor to the transmission or the transaxle with a drive shaft, and it had a fan cooler on it. Never had to replace a belt. And that was heavy-duty. They had a cast-iron heavy-duty rear end, the Kohler industrial motor in it. They were a really solid, rugged tractor, and one of the first things that MTD did in the 80s was they got rid of that cast iron rear end and replaced it with an aluminum one to save money, and I guess it made it lighter, but it was an aluminum transmission instead of a cast iron transmission. And then around the late 90s, the Cubs, until around 2000 or late 1990s, those tractors always shared attachments. I had a mid-90s Cub Cadet that I could take the old International Harvester wide frame attachments. They fit on there perfectly. But then they had this harebrained idea in the late 90s they would save some money. So they made this big thing about automotive style hubs. Well, they always had automotive style hubs. They were 5-bolt, and they went to this 4-bolt. And they had some lawn tractors with the shaft driven, so that was the 2000 series. The garden tractor was the 3000 series. Of course, they had the 1000 series. And around, 98 or so, they looked like an egg. And I think that's really when the quality started to go down. I have an XT3 Cub Cadet, and I think it's a good tractor. Cub Cadet was the first one to introduce electric lift and electric steering together on tractors, and instead of having a hydraulic circuit, it was electric or electronic, and I don't know that that's a good idea. The jury's still out on that. I know that when you charge the battery, you have to disconnect the battery from the tractor. You'll blow out the electronic power steering. You've already got a hydraulic circuit in the transmission, so it's not a big deal in my mind to have a circuit for the power steering, but I digress considerably now. So Cub Cadet in recent years, they had the XT1, XT2, XT3 series. The 1 and 2, the 1 series was sold by box stores. They were kind of a scaled down. I think they're just a throwaway tractor. The XT2 was an exclusive at the dealership. They were a little bit better. They had better tires. They had some premium motors in them. A little bit better tractor. Still, they only had a kind of a cheesy transmission in them, so I didn't think that they were that great. They had a garden series with a belt drive that was a little bit better. But the shaft-driven tractors were still in place until like last year, 2021 or 22. And I'm told by the Cub Cadet dealer that Black & Decker had bought 20% of the company a few years ago, and then like in 2019 they bought the rest of it for like $1.3 billion. And if you know tools, you know that Stanley Black & Decker purveys electric and battery-operated equipment. That's their thing. So hedge trimmers, weed whackers, all those things are all battery operated. I think Makita and Stanley Black & Decker and maybe DeWalt, I'm not sure, there's like, or Milwaukee, there's only like 3 companies that make all the batteries, and then other companies will rebrand them. But regardless, what MTD has decided, I think they've discontinued the XT3 tractor, so no more shaft-driven tractors. They want to push this battery-operated tractor, which I think is a stupid idea. Those of you who've been around for a little while remember in the early 70s, both IH and John Deere had an electric rear-engine lawn tractor that had these batteries in it, and they only ran for like an hour, and then you had to charge them for like 8 hours. So, people who have more than a postage stamp size yard, they don't want to charge a tractor for 8 hours to use it for an hour. They want to turn the key and have it run. So I don't think that was a great idea on their part, but I think the ultimate demise of Cub Cadet has finally come. I think that the whole thing behind Cub Cadet, their shaft-driven tractors, is gone now, and they're battery operated, and they have the cheap transmissions driven by belts. So I don't think they're any better than the cheapest things you buy at Walmart or Home Depot or Lowe's or Menards or wherever you buy them. Still, they're just a junky cheap tractor now, and it's unfortunate. In 1997, Cub Cadet MTD had entered an agreement with Mitsubishi Japan. Now, I've already told you that Mitsubishi Japan had built tractors for International Harvester and Case IH. Well, they entered an agreement with Cub Cadet MTD to build compact utility tractors, and they were a good tractor. I owned 2 of them. They initially had this blue and black stripe on them, and they were really a pretty tractor. They were a solid tractor, cast iron transmissions, Mitsubishi motors. I really liked my Mitsubishi Cub Cadets. They were good tractors. And I think around 2006, so from 96 to 2006, they were Mitsubishis, and then in 2006, for whatever reason, they stopped with Mitsubishi. I think Mitsubishi had some troubles with their cars and stuff, so they kind of were reestablishing their company or whatnot. But Cub Cadet MTD got into an agreement with Yanmar, Japan. So Yanmar builds and designs all their own tractors. They paint them green for John Deere, and they were building the yellow ones for Cub Cadet. So they said Yanmar Cub Cadet or Cub Cadet Yanmar. They were black and yellow, and those were good tractors. They had, about this time, they came out with a 5000 series. They had the 7000 series that I've already told you about with the Mitsubishi. Then they had an 8000 series. So the 5000 series were like made by, I think, Dadong or something, and they could get it with a little diesel motor or a Kohler motor, and they had tons of troubles. They're fraught with issues. I would never advise you to buy a 5000 series Cub Cadet utility tractor. They're garbage. They have all kinds of troubles. The 7000 series Mitsubishis were good, and the Cub Cadet Yanmars were good, and I'm told you can still get all the parts for those Cub Cadet Yanmars from the Yanmar dealer. The 8000 series were made by Coyote, and whether Coyote supports that agreement, I don't know. But so you had three different, and four entities. You had Dadong, you had Coyote, you had Mitsubishi, you had Yanmar, and they were all building these tractors for Cub Cadet. And then in 2011, no more Cub Cadet tractors. They Yanmar ceased their agreement with MTD, and they dropped the Cub Cadet name, and they just became Yanmar tractors. The dealer that is near me told me that when he was selling the Mitsubishi Cub Cadets, they might have sold 6 or 8 a year, barely sold any, so that's probably why Yanmar broke off the agreement. They just weren't selling tractors through Cub Cadet. It was probably more of a nightmare than it was worth with the parts conversions and everything else. But then when they went to Mahindra, they selling over 100 a year. So interestingly, Mitsubishi does build a couple models for Mahindra, and I think those are a pretty solid tractor. But regardless, here we are, 2023, and no more Cub Cadet shaft-driven tractors, no more Cub Cadet utility tractors. The Cub name is pretty much just a sticker on the side of a piece of junk now, as far as I'm concerned, and it's unfortunate. I hope you enjoyed the video. A lot of period advertisements all the way from 1964 up through up through the present. I've got things all the way up to now as far as Cub Cadet goes. The last Cub Cadets rolled off the line in 1979, and there was a hardware store that got the letter and said they were the last recipient, or the recipient of the very last Cub tractor, and that tractor was preserved for a little while, but then they had a fire and the tractor burned up and it wasn't repaired, and the fate of that tractor is unknown at this time. It was probably scrapped, but the very last Cub tractor to come off the line, nobody knows where it is. They know where it went, but nobody knows where it is now. The first tractor is in a museum, but Cub tractors still can get lots of parts for them. Parts readily available. They made thousands of them. Made them for about 35 years. Great tractors, and I do appreciate you watching the video. I'm sorry to ramble off at the mouth a little bit, but there was a lot of information I wanted to get out to you. If you haven't already, please take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Please comment down below on your thoughts about Cub tractors. I really appreciate it. And without any further chatter, let's go look at all the material that I've got to show you.